Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reedy with Future Pastimes, and we're reading Dune. We're on to a chapter now that starts with Paul and Lady Jessica, and they're still in the ornithopter, still in the storm. But Paul is sensing that they are close to the top. They're able to get out of the storm, and the storm itself is beginning to wind down. And so Paul is able to navigate through the vortex to get to a point where they can try to safely land the ornithopter. He wants to land it in sand, but close to rock, because he knows that the landing of the ornithopter is quite likely to attract a worm. And as they're coming in for the landing, he notices that the ornithopter has taken quite a beating. There's some holes in it as sand and wind is getting into the cabin. And the wings feel very jittery, and in fact, one of them caves and collapses in, folding in on itself. So he brings it in, trying to slow their landing by hitting some sand dunes a little bit, and then they do crash. And so he tells Lady Jessica that they need to be very quick and they need to run for the rock. And indeed, as they are making their way to the rock over the sand, they can hear and feel and sense that a worm is coming, and one does come, and Paul looks back and the ornithopter is gone, but they do safely make it to rock, although it's exhausting running across the sand. And what's interesting in this chapter is over the next several segments of it, the next several pages, they are climbing over rock because it's safer to be on rock. The worms won't bother them there. But it's very rough going. And Herbert really describes the different qualities that the desert has, as well as the rocks, the slippery sections that can cause them to fall, and the sharp edges of the rocks that cut their hands. And it's a very vivid, evocative description, which I think is really interesting about this chapter. So they realize that they need to get around this section of rock, and then they can see that there's several kilometers of desert before the next set of rock, which they're going to have to attempt to cross. But Paul says they need to do it like the Fremen. They need to cross at night, not during the day. It'll be just too brutal out in the open desert, and they'll be too exposed as well. And he explains to Lady Jessica that if they can walk without rhythm, if they can sound like just the sand shifting and falling, worms don't investigate every single sound. So if it sounds like natural desert activity on the sand, they can move without attracting attention. But they've got to get to a position on the other side of a big section of rock so that they are at the base of it and spend the day in their still tents resting, and then they'll make the attempt. But it's still rough going, and Lady Jessica is realizing that the constant exertion and having to keep moving, they don't have a moment to rest, and so it feels more desperate to her. She says, there can be no mercy without stopping. And that's a Bene Gesserit mind at work there. So they do eventually get close to there, but they've got to slide down this section. And what happens is Paul slides down first, but then as Lady Jessica is following after, it causes a sand cave-in, essentially, that buries Lady Jessica. And Paul is a little bit panicked. He knows in the back of his head that she's not going to be instantly smothered, that he has some time to try to dig her out and find her. And he also knows that because of her Bene Gesserit training, she'll go into something called Bindu suspension, which is one of those things where, you slow your heart rate and you're breathing down, and so you can go longer without air, that sort of thing. It's not a new concept. So he's digging her out. And he does manage to get her out of there, but he realizes that he has also lost their Frem pack and their Frem kit. and has their still tent and their water and a lot of other stuff. And so for a little bit here, he's just very cynical. He's like, well, let's take a good look around at the place where we're going to die. And Lady Jessica, she knows, as a Bene Gesserit, as a skilled Bene Gesserit, she knows how to manipulate him into focusing on the problem at hand. And so she does. She goads him, and then she just sits back and lets his mentat mind and Bene Gesserit training take over, and he realizes that they can potentially dig out the Fremkit if it's where he estimates that it is, if they can find a way to hold off more sand from coming in. And to do that, they would need water, or better yet, foam. And he realizes that if he can combine spice with some of the chemical elements of the paracompass that he does still have, he can create a foam. And so he does a little Fremen walk out into the desert because they notice that there is spice nearby. And so he gathers some and brings it back, and he's able to create a foam barrier with the sand so that they can dig it out, and they do manage to rescue their pack. So part of what also goes on in this chapter is a little more of an understanding of the still suit, where the Lady Jessica is trying to be very stingy with her water, but Paul is like, no, you have to drink the water in the catch pockets of your still suit, because the best place to store your water is in your body. So your body will make more water that gets processed by the still suit. And so she does. She drinks all of that, and it gives her the energy. And so Paul is more and more trying to think like a Fremen based on what he knows and based on what he assumes, using his mentat and Bene Gesserit awareness. Another thing that happens in this chapter is that Paul is occasionally still having some memories of dreams and visions, and he's realizing that he kind of recognizes some of these areas from a dream, but there's something different about it. So it's like he's standing in a different place, or it's not quite unfolding it. And in one of the visions, he tells himself, yeah, I remember this vision, and Duncan was with us, but he's not with us now. And what's really going on here is this idea of the prescience that Paul is experiencing and that one can get from consuming the spice, but it's more heightened because of his heritage, because he's potentially the Kwisatz Haderach, and he's had this Bene Gesserit training and this mentat training. What he's learning about prescience is that it's not a vision of the future, it's a vision of a future. And that's going to become more and more prevalent throughout the book as we get deeper into it. This idea that the prescience lets you see the future, but it's possible futures, likely futures in many cases, but not certain. And in some areas, it's blocked utterly. And he describes it in the book. One point is like you can see into the future, but it's like going into a valley. You know that there's stuff on the other side of that hill or mountain, but because you've dipped down into it, it's blocked from you. So that I think is interesting as well. There's one other element in here where Lady Jessica is talking to Paul, and she realizes, he's asking, are you strong enough to go on right now? Are you ready to go? And she reads between the lines about she's pregnant at this point, but she explains she's not very far along, and she's going to be adequate to the task. And she's like, how formally I'm addressing my son, and why is that? And she uses her Bene Gesserit insight. One of the things is whenever they have this question is to attack it head on and get to the bottom, the root cause analysis. And she realizes that she's a little bit afraid of Paul. She's afraid for Paul, but she's also afraid of what he is or might be. And that's it's an uncertainty that a parent would naturally grapple with, I think. And but the fact that everything is so heightened with Paul because he's the Duke, because he's been trained, and because of, again, that lineage of being the Kwisatz Haderach, that is a very, very powerful being. And Lady Jessica is quite familiar with the lore and the stories about what the Kwisatz Haderach will be or be able to do. She understands the true power of the Bene Gesserit, and that a man could have that power or be even more powerful is very daunting. So this all feeds into why she might be a little bit afraid of her son. It's not something she's like, oh no, I got to worry about him, but she's like, it's at the back of her head. So I find that interesting as well. It's a fairly slow chapter. It's a good number of pages. It's very descriptive, so there's not a lot of action. They are worried about the worm, but it's not a serious problem when they're trying to get away from the one that destroys the ornithopter. And the cave in with the sand, is a little bit exciting, but not pivotal. And there's really never a sense of like, oh, he's not going to find her and it's too late. Even as he's scrambling to dig her out, he's confident he's going to be able to get to her. In terms of adaptation, this has been probably more closely adapted by Villeneuve in the latest Dune movie. They do have Paul gets them out of the storm with the ornithopter, and they do crash land. They make it more dramatic, crash landing in the movie, which they also did with the Lynch movie. It was much more dramatic in terms of the crashing and then getting away from the worm. The Villeneuve movie also, it takes its time, which is interesting and surprising, considering that they were worried about the movie being too long, and they cut a lot of the stuff that the fans were like, why did you cut all that? Yet you put more into this, the journey of Paul and Jessica across the sand. But there are a lot of touches that connect to the book. There's less of the tension between Paul and Jessica, which I think actually is a little bit more apparent in the Lynch version. You get that sense that Francesca Annis, who plays Lady Jessica, is a little bit fearful of Paul, and and again, it's not a serious fearful, but wary and observing what this new iteration of Paul is going to be like. They do have the little sense of the visions. They make a bigger deal about the prescient and the possible alternate visions in future in the Villeneuve movie, not necessarily as it pertains to the given situation, but they have all these flashbacks of conversations he has with Jamis that ultimately never actually happened. But the fact that they could have happened, they might have happened, and even in some case probably should have happened, is interesting, and it's subtle in a way. And I think a lot of people first watching the Villeneuve movie will be a little bit confused by it. They're not sure what it is or what it means, why they're seeing these visions of it. Because at this point in the movie, you've barely seen Jamis. He shows up a little bit at the very beginning during the Chani prologue, but it's not until after this chapter that we actually meet Jamis. So spoiler alert there if we're reading this for the first time. But with this idea of having the prescience and seeing alternate futures, those seeds are being baked in right now in the Villeneuve movie, and that will become clear by the time you reach the end of the movie, and probably more so by the end of the second movie, but definitely upon repeated viewings, that becomes more and more obvious that that's what that is. So the chapter ends with them fixing to cross the desert and heading towards an area of rock where they have detected some vegetation, and Paul suspects that if there's vegetation there, then it's the Fremen. And this too, they did in the book. So you get a sense of that. They didn't do. No one has adapted the whole collapsing sand, dig out Lady Jessica. That's how little any of the directors and writers of the adaptations felt that was necessary. And so you get that takeaway, I think, when you're reading in the chapter. It wasn't a necessary element, but it's keeping the story moving forward. It's interesting. It's showing you that everywhere in the desert there are dangers. It's not just the worms or ornithopters or the Fremen. It's the desert itself is very tough on anybody out there. And that the fact that the Fremen choose to be here, more or less, like, this is it. We love this place. It's great. They are trying to transform it into a paradise, but most of them realize it's not something that happens in their lifetime. So they do take a certain amount of pride into being able to live off the land as it is on Arrakis, which most people would say can't be done. So There you have it for this chapter. If you have any other questions about it, hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you think as we continue forward. And thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.